Everybody just type this in chat, but we're just giving you a chance to get yourself settled in audio-wise before we begin. Welcome. All right. I'm sure people will continue to file in, so I'll make sure I type this all in the chat area so people can reference it if they come in a bit later. But hello and welcome to today's coffee break. Before I hand it off to the panel, I just wanted to cover a few tech logistics here. This is a Zoom webinar, very similar to Zoom meeting with the exception that your cameras and microphones are disabled by default, and we will not be enabling them. So if you want to interact with us, whether it's a question for the panel or any kind of commentary, you'd want to use the Q&A specifically for questions anyway. If you've got a technical issue, go ahead and pop that in the chat and we'll make sure that it's addressed as soon as possible. For the chat itself, if you want everyone to see a comment, then make sure you select all panelists and attendees from the drop-down window there. But for Q&A, you can ask questions anonymously, you can upvote existing questions, and you can add your own comments to them if you so wish. So without further ado, I want to hand it off to Melanie Gottlieb.
Thanks, Mike. Good afternoon and happy Friday. I'm Melanie Gottlieb, Deputy Director of ACRO, and I'd like to welcome you to our fall series of the Coffee Breaks, an opportunity for ACRO members to discuss important and timely topics in a more casual and interactive environment. We know that all of you are really busy at the beginning of your fall semester, and we thank you for joining us as you close out your week. As always, we're hopeful that our technology will not fail us. This is a fairly large Zoom call, and we at ACRO, like many of you, remain at the mercies of our home Wi-Fi, so please be patient with us. You may use the chat freely while on the webinar. If you have a question for a panelist, please use the Q&A section to ask that question, and we'll get it in at the Q&A at the end. Please also note which panelist the question is for, if that question is specifically for them. So, to our panelists, joining me today are three excellent colleagues from the West Coast. We're glad that they're here and safe. We have Belinda Maria Sandoval Zazueta, Associate Vice President of Admissions at the University of Redlands in California. We have Erin Hayes, Director of Undergraduate Admission at Gonzaga University in Washington, and James Miller, Director of Admissions at Seattle University in Washington. Before we jump into this discussion, I want to direct you to our COVID practice pages. Next slide. We have combined the resources and guidance pages that we had created previously into over the spring into a single reference page that includes all of our COVID-related guidance, endorsing alternative practices for your institutions in this time of crisis. It's important to note that more than ever before, as you implement policy and practice changes, whether temporary or permanent, you incorporate clear communication and transparency with all your stakeholders, an approach that's consistent with your mission and mission and philosophy, and consistency of application in the best interests of your students and your campus. To build our guidance, we use established ACRO standards and re-envision them through the lens of the current COVID-19 crisis, and then consult with subject matter experts from our board of directors and amongst the membership. We're here to ensure that ACRO brings you the tools and information that you need to serve your institutions and your students in this dynamically changing environment. It seems as if COVID time, the acceleration of change and the compression of decision-making and implementation timelines is here to stay for a while, and ACRO is here to help. Next slide. I'd like you to take a look and watch for the COVID-19 Impact Practice Snapshot surveys. The first fall survey will launch later this month, and we'll be looking at impacts of 2020 disruptions on your work and career. This will be a valuable resource. And feel free to reference our spring surveys and they're noted on the left, and you can find them on our COVID practice pages. Next slide. I'll give a quick plug for this audience. Available in the bookstore today is an Acro Classic at the SEM Core Concepts book. Author Dr. Wayne Sigler is widely viewed as one of the top enrollment professionals in the country. We're lucky to have him working with Acro, and we hope that you will take a look at that book if you are not already familiar with it. Mike, if you could launch the audience poll, the first poll, that would be great. Before we launch into the discussion, it's always helpful to know who we have here in the audience today. So what segment of our profession do you represent? And then, are you an Acro roster member? And we'll give you a minute or two to answer those questions.
Cue Jeopardy music. I need to really start bringing that in whenever we have polls.
Yeah, we really do. It's been on my list like since the spring. I think that would be a fun.
I'll download it for our next coffee break.
You could just hum it, Mike. We all know it.
This is true. I'll leave it open.
Let me know.
For another. Yeah, I'll leave it open for a minute. So we got about 10 seconds left, and then I'll write the results. All right, closing now.
All right. So it looks like mostly admissions folks and a few other higher ed staff and a few other. So welcome. I appreciate you giving us the time today. And take a look. I couldn't see the Acro member piece, but that's all right. I'll take a look after.
It was actually kind of an even split. It was about 44% members, 37 non, and then non-roster members, but at roster institutions.
Excellent. All right. So again, when we were planning this session, there were a couple of really relevant themes in the discussion that emerged, and around reinvention of your jobs and the jobs of your staff, and around the management of staff in general. And so I think in our discussion, I'd like to start with those role reinventions. Could each of you talk about how you have already and are likely to continue to reimagine your work to attract and enroll students at your institutions? And what are some of the things that are new for both you and for your teams? And I'd like to maybe start with James.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks to Acro for hosting us all. It's a real pleasure to be here and an honor to be with the panelists on this panel. So, you know, when we were discussing this question in prep, I think we were all relating to this idea that, number one, almost everything about our work, you know, things that many of us have been doing for years and perhaps even decades at this point, are all completely upside down and backwards, you know, and just even relating to the simple idea that, you know, popping into a school visit, which is a zone we're all relatively comfortable in an admissions office, and seeing, you know, cameras off and microphones with slashes through them, and just having this experience of, I don't know if I can do this, right? I don't have the tool set or the skill set. So I think, like, you know, the first and foremost has been, you know, really actually guiding the staff through both a little bit of the grieving process that comes with, you know, a lot of the things we love about this work being at least temporarily on hiatus, but then also really, like, you know, working with the staff and being so inspired by how creative and thoughtful they've been in delivering solutions. I think in particular at Seattle U, you know, and I'm sure this is similar for my colleagues, it's been a real opportunity for us to reconsider the idea of inclusion in our admissions events, and who is it that gets to make it to an event on campus or to a high school visit, and who is it that doesn't? And certainly a big part of that for us has been thinking about different modalities in which we can deliver sessions, not just the traditional straight ahead presentation where you kind of speak to the audience, give a chance to answer any questions they have and call it a day, but ways, especially I think for our area, to create community, right? Which is a big thing in this process, is to give students an opportunity to preview that experience that they'll have with fellow students, whether it's in a virtual classroom or in a real one. And so I think I think that's been the biggest thing, is thinking about new ways to develop that experience of community in a space that isn't exactly conducive, right? That kind of flattens the experience that we have with one another if we're not careful. So that would be the thing I would share, but I'm sure my fellow panelists have some thoughts as well.
I think I'll just add, and echo what James shared on two fronts. One on thank you to ACRO and to all of you that are listening in on this session, this coffee break. But also, I would say the building community piece is really important. And I think we're still struggling and trying to figure out how you do that. And as we begin fall travel, well, what's funny is we still call it travel. A lot of us are like, oh, we're starting fall travel season. And it's quite funny that we have to correct ourselves. There's not travel, it's recruitment. So there's definitely a shift, right, in just all of our thinking. But the community piece, I think, becomes really imperative in the conversation, because I think we have started to see, you go into these spaces, into these unfamiliar spaces, and you're not really sure how you're going to be received. So there's a bit of that challenge. What I would also add to that, though, is, this has been a time of great growth. We started to explore opportunities to do virtual visits last year, and that was really coming from initiatives of thinking about how to do more outreach in rural communities. And so we dabbled a little bit in the virtual spaces, but didn't think we were going to go full head in or full feet in, whatever, so quickly. And so I think it's given our team an opportunity to really think outside the box, to think about how do we leverage new tools, and to think about new ways of solving problems. And so, everything from the big issue of how do you outreach to students and what are the best tools to do that, but also the real, what we feel sometimes are kind of in the weed problems of oh my gosh, my tech is out, my audio went down, what do I do right now? Or, I'm trying to log into a high school visit and my internet's not working, or I'm frozen. And so, it's just new ways, I think, of figuring out how to solve problems. So those are a couple of things that I would add.
Hi, everyone. So nice to be here today. Thank you to ACRO for inviting me. I do have my coffee because it's a coffee talk. So I hope you all have your coffee ready. I would echo everything that James and Belinda had to say. And really, this is a great opportunity to actually build out that virtual programming that we've talked about for a couple of years. And we're really trying to start to focus on this last year. And then it just became we're not going to try to add virtual to our in-person. We're just going to be virtual. So it pushed us in a good direction in that way. But one thing I did talk with the office about over the summer is that people were very forgiving with us in the spring because it was all so new. And I knew we were going to have to just really up our game a bit over the summer and get prepared for maybe higher expectations in the fall for what virtual learning looks like. So we did reimagine some of our presentations to just make them a little more dynamic. We had scripted out a lot of our presentations in the spring just so everyone felt really comfortable and they knew what to say with each slide and things like that. But then now I'm pushing people to not be robotic, and no, you still need to be natural. The script is there to help you, but it's not there to just read. You still have, somehow we have to find ways to connect with people in this virtual space. And that's, I think, a big challenge. And we're definitely putting a little more funding into digital marketing, trying to reach students where they're at. always my concern is underrepresented and first gen college students. And I really don't know what they're going to be experiencing this fall. Are they going to have greater access to their high school counselors, less? Are they going to be less engaged? So that's going to be, those will be populations that I'm going to keep my eye on as our stats come in through the fall, to make sure that we're really reaching students where they are somehow, and making sure they know college and Gonzaga are available to them. And we really want them to apply to college and make this possible.
Almost forgot to turn my mic back on. Thanks to all of you for sharing that. I know it's a really sort of challenging task to rethink basically everything that you're doing. One of the things that I know that a lot of institutions use in the admissions process that's been in the news of late is testing. And I'm interested to know where our audience is on this issue right now. Michael, can you launch the next poll, which is just taking a quick pulse on testing? And for those of you who are institution-based, which describes your admission testing policy right now? If you could take a minute and just answer that, that would be great. He got it. Okay, that was funny.
Pretty well.
All right, so it looks like 22% testing still playing a role. Another 17 and 36 are moving away, and another 26 never been an important factor. So thanks, that's good information. I would love to know where our panelists are on this issue. So, and I think we'll start with Belinda.
I have to say, this is a fun coffee break already. Great music. Thanks, Michael. So for the University of Redlands, we kind of have we've been thinking and talking about and researching, or had been prior to the pandemic, had really been putting some energy and effort and thinking about testing at our institution. And so after, as many of you know, sort of a process, right? It's not just you dream up an idea and then it happens. And so, meetings with, faculty governance and doing the gathering data and putting a proposal together and all of that was really, it took time and energy to do that. And so we were doing that pre-pandemic. The interesting thing is we literally, went out with our announcement of being test optional on March the 10th. And I will never forget that day because there was so much happening in our world. And I'll be honest, there was a moment where I looked at my VP of admissions and I was like, do we go out, with this, given everything that's happening? But we were right there. And so we announced that we were going test optional, and we're very proud of that. It absolutely makes sense for our institution. And then, then most of us started working from home, and the reality of the pandemic started to settle in, and the world kind of stopped. And so, while we went out prior to the pandemic, it definitely feels like we are with all the institutions that sort of went out post or during the pandemic, right after. Feels like we're just kind of in that group too, because we, like many of you, are in that process of still trying to sift out what does that look like. And I've spent a lot of time, since March and this summer and continuing on to really think about the process to make sure that this is what we want it to be. And so, and that our institution is prepared and ready in our reviews and all of that. So, so that's kind of where we are. And I think, for us, it's, there's been an opportunity, I think, for us as institutions to really make some public statements about test optional, right? And what that means, and a lot of opportunities for clarification on what that means for our students. And so, those of us that are members of NACAC have been talking about sort of test optional means test optional, and just reaffirming that our policy does really mean that we're going to practice holistic admissions and not disadvantage students in any way, given the state of affairs for testing right now.
So I can go next. I think, and there was a comment put into the chat, which I think is helpful, the clarification of what you mean by test optional. I think, that's a really actually great question. To Belinda's point, is especially in these times, it is so critical to lead with specificity when we're communicating with students. And I think that, in going towards the decision of going test optional, we were in a similar position to Redlands, where we had commissioned a test optional working group in January, not really realizing that it would become the massive issue that it is now. The particular policy at Seattle U is kind of, I guess, what you would think of as the classic definition, which is that we are not requiring students to submit testing. However, students must indicate which type of program they wish to apply under, whether it's with testing or without, so that the student has to formally indicate which way they would like to be reviewed. The premise of which being that a test score is just like any other piece of an application that helps us to understand who you are as a student, and what your capacity is to be successful at our institution, right? Rather than this kind of hallmark bedrock thing that every student must do. I'll leave the kind of I guess philosophical debates to what will be, I think, some really great programming at the SEM conference in particular coming up around holistic admission and what factors are important and what factors can help us make those determinations. But I think driving very much what we're thinking about at Seattle U is this real question of access, and not in the kind of like surface level way we sometimes say that word, but really, really, really deeply. There are many students who simply going into the fall have not been able to sit for an SAT or an ACT exam. And those that are able to sit this fall come from a disproportionately advantaged set of circumstances. And so I think if we're requiring testing, we need to have some very, in my humble opinion, some very specific reasons why we're moving forward with a policy like that, given what a challenge it is, I think, ethically for us to say, community spread is a big problem around COVID-19, and we're going to be encouraging then students to rush into gyms with 300 students and sit for an SAT or an ACT exam. And so that's, I think, the biggest concern we have, is trying to communicate what it means specifically for admission, what it means specifically for major entry, and what it means for financial aid purposes, and trying to be out there as much as we can with the specifics around that policy for students.
Absolutely. Here. And what was interesting for us this year is we were examining the role of test scores in our process and holding on to them a little bit for nursing and engineering direct admission programs. But we were looking to just greatly reduce the role that they played in our process and in the amount that they would count towards a merit scholarship. So we were cutting their importance by half in our review. And then we needed to go test optional due to COVID-19. So now we spent some time this summer creating 2 different review processes. Of course, people wanted those answers immediately. Like, what's it going to look like for us? Well, we're not sure. We need a little time to really carefully and intentionally put this together. Since we have our plans in place now, I did send an email message out to students, hoping their families would see it as well, explicitly stating, we are test optional. You do not need an SAT or ACT. You have the same access to admissions, scholarships, special programs like nursing and engineering, special scholarships, just the honors program, trying to really explicitly state that you do not have to have a test this year, and also telling students, please stop trying to register for a test because they're getting canceled. It's so frustrating for them. And students have tested positive for COVID after taking tests during the summer. So we're not trying to put people in any sort of delicate situation or dangerous situation. I will not take credit for that email going out. I got the idea from John Bach instead, who put in a NACAC listserv that he had sent out a message to their inquiries. So if anyone would like me to just send you the email that I sent out, I'd be happy to share it. I'm perfectly happy with sharing resources and ideas. We're all in this together. But if you are still using test scores, I do want you to know families are panicked about it. And if you could pull back on those, it'd be really helpful. I did a college night 2 nights ago, and I was very firm about not having to have a test. And still the parents were not believing. And in the chat, they're like, when's the next test? And they're talking to each other about, like, when do you think we can register for a test? When's the latest? And I just thought they're not pulling back. And so if we can help them get comfortable with the idea that their student can apply without a test, that'd be great.
Thanks for all of you for sharing that. It's interesting to note that folks were moving towards a more holistic admission process regardless, but interesting that we see that COVID has accelerated everything, right? Yeah, all of these decisions, all of our planning, all of our timelines. And so it's interesting how that has played out. So I want to move to another topic that came up in our conversations that I think is really important. So reimagining the role as a result of the pandemic, because higher ed and secondary staff are all working remotely, or majority working remotely, or in some sort of socially distant fashion. And it poses a particular set of challenges to our work. But there's more going on here that we have to acknowledge and recognize. There's a whole highly polarized election coming around the corner. There's rising activities around equity and social justice, and there's climate change issues like hurricanes and like fires, right? It's 2020. And so can you talk a little bit about what it means to be a team leader in admissions right now? What's your biggest struggle and how are you managing that? And we'll start with Erin.
Yeah, it has been a heck of a 6 months here that we've all been working under. I think just setting the context of all of our admission offices most likely have a pretty wide range of ages within our offices of the professionals working in admission. And there are quite a few who are just out of college who are working as admission counselors. And this is their first experience with maybe a national or global tragedy or concern. And it's a lot for people to manage and emotionally. And for those of us who have experienced maybe challenging times, this is still so much bigger than I think what a lot of us have ever gone through. In that roller coaster, we really feel it in the office where one person might be in a good place one day while someone else is down, and they switch places. And it's just been like that throughout the 6 months. So really heightened emotions. One thing I did was just go to more frequent meetings during the spring where we were checking in 3 times a week. We have our regular weekly staff meeting, but then quick check-ins. I was in a different situation because we just restructured our office going into this last year, and I had 8 new employees. And so there was a lot of, never experiencing spring in general. And then experiencing spring with COVID was really hard. So just trying to be as transparent as possible, be as communicative as possible. But we're really in a position of being change management leaders right now. And a lot of people don't like change. And so this is a big stress among our colleagues. Their job descriptions are different. 33% travel, nope. 33% Zoom is more like it. So really just trying to be flexible and communicative, flexible in the way of when we were all working at home, there were some younger counselors who wanted to go back to their parents' houses and work from home there. Absolutely. Go to Southern California, do work there. That's fine. We're all virtual, no problem. And then just with all the changes, really putting a lot of new trainings into place over the summer, and now anti-racism trainings with our office of, with our diversity office, diversity and inclusion, new trainings on how to review an application without test scores, and just open dialogue and in our meetings, and really focusing on being proactive right now, because COVID's with us through the year. So how can we plan ahead? Because all the reactive stuff we were doing in the spring and even into the summer created a lot of discomfort. So really focusing on, stop, regroup, and get proactive. So those are some of the things that we've been doing in my office, but there are lots of ups and downs for sure.
Yeah, I would actually, pick up on just because it's very easy for me to end up in a negative place as I think about all the impacts we've had. But one of the real positives has been, I think, number one, realizing that we can be incredibly productive in a remote setting, that some of the fears I think we've had in the past of having staff be mostly remote throughout the year, even though, we see our staff travel and read mostly from places not the office. Really seeing that operate through half a cycle has been actually really gratifying. And we've seen some really, I think, good outcomes in terms of work-life balance, and as much as you can have that when your meeting space is also your living room or den in my case. But I think, one of the things that has been a real challenge is that management of emotional well-being as we go through this, because undoubtedly the pandemic alone has created like a place of crisis operation for people, because it's not just an emergency at work, right? It's not just an enrollment crisis. It's also, for many people, a personal crisis, right? Whether you had a person impacted by COVID, or you're worried about it, or you're a caretaker for someone who is immune compromised, all things that we went through this last 6 months, helping people manage those emotional states while also kind of trying to figure out, like, where is the line as a leader, where I am now across into a space where I'm helping to support this person, but compromising my own emotional health and well-being in trying to help everyone else. I think the other thing I want to touch on that is not pandemic related, but certainly has a pandemic confluence, is the real struggle for lifting up the importance and meaning of Black lives, and really taking cues from I guess, like, people who, particularly people of color, who have I think been real leaders in the space of helping those of us who are white supervisors to check in, particularly with our Black colleagues, because as has been quoted many times, they are not okay. And so really doing my own work on like, how do I acknowledge and how do I support without doing that inappropriately and struggling through the awkwardness of that feeling, but also, like, really for the first time in my working life, really trying to, like, get into that space of supporting folks who are going through major challenges because of, again, like, a major social justice struggle that's happening in our country, hopefully for for a meaningful for a meaningful change for the future. But yeah, it's been a real challenge. I mean, it's been really difficult, and I guess like monitoring my own health and well-being, and like noticing when I'm getting that tired to the marrow feeling, like how am I able to unplug? What are my opportunities to like create some space for myself and take care of myself so I can be the person I need to be for the team. I think that that's been a major theme in addition to everything else for me.
I will actually kind of just go off of your comment, James. I wouldn't say that for me it's been the biggest struggle, but I would say that it has definitely challenged me to pause, right? Because our work has always been so cyclical, and you kind of know what you're doing in the summer, right? You're planning and preparing, and for us as a team, we did have to pause and say the world is different, and when we think about issues of equity and social justice, and when we're talking about systemic racism, right? Like what we had to pause and say, what are we doing, right? What is our responsibility as an Office of Admission, both to our colleagues and to our current students, but also, is there messaging that we need to be saying and sharing to our prospective students as well? And so at the University of Redlands, we do have in the admissions office a diversity team. And so we kind of sat together and really brainstorming and thinking through what are some tangible things that we can be doing. We certainly don't have all the answers, but it was just, let's talk about some real practical things that we can do. And one of the outcomes out of that was actually a reframing and reworking of our annual admissions retreat. The retreat that we typically have in August, where we get to know a little bit about ourselves, but also we start to talk about our goals for the year and travel and marketing and all of these things. And we just said, we can't get there until we pause and really talk about what is going on in the world. And so that retreat really took on a whole other, we devoted hours to more conversation around diversity, to getting to know each other on a deeper level, to really trying to understand what is happening in our world. And I think that was really beneficial for us. We did the privilege walk in a very interesting way because we were not together, but we did it through Zoom. And I really give a huge thanks to Alicia Knox on my team, who really took a moment to really help us move through and really lead our team through that time. And it's a continued conversation for us. So I think when I think about what is happening in addition to all of these things, I think we as admissions directors and folks on leadership teams in our institutions, I think we're being called really to step up and to bring light these issues and to really think about how we navigate this time and make sure that we are being a voice on these issues, and I think in a public way. That can be stressful, that's not easy. And like, James said, I mean, when you're thinking about sort of where you sit, in a leadership team, and in my position, I'm like, as a woman of color, to try to say, okay, how am I going to come to this conversation? How am I going to be a public sort of voice to this when I myself am struggling, when I myself don't feel like I'm always in safe spaces to voice that, right? But I think that's what we're being called to do, is challenging ourselves to be there. I think the other piece that's really interesting, is as we think about where we are in the recruitment, many of us are also starting to do our fall 21 planning, if we haven't already, and really thinking about, what's the class going to look like, and starting to build budgets perhaps around that planning. And I think that to me is probably one of the biggest struggles right now, is trying to think about how do I put a number out there or propose, what our applications might look like, knowing that it's still early in the cycle, but knowing we have to plan now for fall 21 with so much uncertainty. So that's a struggle. I don't have an answer for, but it's a struggle for sure that I'm putting out to the universe, just some anomaly in our metrics of last year and trying to reconcile all of that.
Thank you all for sharing that. So that we're not ending the discussion on the most bummer note and can move into the Q&A. I do want to ask, you know, there's lots of media buzz about how the pandemic has changed or is going to change higher education permanently. What do you see, or what have you implemented at your institution that you think is really positive and should or will stick around for the long term as a result of the pandemic? And I think Belinda, I think I have you first on that one.
It's interesting to think about, you know, how to respond to that, because what I want to say is all of it, everything we're doing. I'll share this anecdote. Is, you know, we were 3 days away from our admitted students day with hundreds of RSVPs. It was our admitted students day our first one was going to be March 14th. And we had to pivot. And I remember part of that planning is a bit of a blur, but part of it is also kind of ingrained in my mind when I had that realization of, like, we're pivoting to online, but we are never going back from here. Like, once we move this operation, this event, to an online opportunity, like, we're just not going back. And I still, you know, now we've heard that probably from lots of different places, but that initial gut instinct that I have of, oh, yep, we're not going back, continues to now become even more of a reality. And so I think, you know, everything that we're doing right now virtually has, I would say, a merit to continuing to live on well beyond the pandemic. It certainly has opened up a lot of opportunities in terms of access. We also know that it has raised some questions around access, right? So in the past, it was like, who are the students that are visiting you, and who has access to do that? And today it's who has access to Wi-Fi, right? And so I think there's still some great questions there. But I think what the technology has really helped us to do is to kind of like what Erin said earlier, kind of accelerate a little bit of some of the work that we were already going into. Our team at the University of Redlands really, I mean, I'm so proud of just how innovative and creative the entire team has been for the last 6 months. Not that they weren't before, but it just has really pushed people to say, goodness, how are we going to do this work? And so I said earlier, you know, some new tools, really thinking about how to leverage that. We've also, you know, had to think through this reaction of wanting to have quantity over quality. And so Erin, you talked a little bit about that, of like, there was maybe grace, a little bit more grace in the spring, but like we really need to tighten the operation and the events as we move into the fall. And so I think we're also talking about how to do that. But we've been using, you know, tools that kind of help us to bring some of that authenticity to life. We've been exploring social media more. We did our first Instagram live tour on this past Tuesday, and the idea is that we're going to have different people on campus from different offices, right? Just different representatives going around and giving a tour every Tuesday, just to show some of the personality and the people, right, that make up the University of Redlands. So I think those are some things. So what are we keeping? What's going to live beyond? I think all of it will live beyond, and we'll just sort of tweak it and make it right as we move through.
I think Belinda covered so many great things that I would say, I echo that. And I know we're going to run out of Q&A time. So I'm just, I'm going to pass it to James if he has anything else he wants to add, but I'm okay with passing over to the Q&A.
Yeah, I am too. I think that's great. Belinda summed it up.
All right. Well, then I would love then to move to the Q&A. So couple of questions I'm gonna ask about. One is related to testing. What about course placement? How are students being placed into math and English courses without using tests?
Yeah, if I can jump on this, because this has been a soapbox of mine for a number of years. But you know, I know that the testing agencies have provided guidance in the past around course placement. I think this has been a really good opportunity, though, for us to step back from the decision to use a minimum SAT score for placement into something like a college algebra or a calculus course, and to really think about like what does a SAT score, let's say a math SAT score in this case, actually represent in terms of a student's ability to do math at a particular level. And really interesting at a place like Seattle U, where we already had a very good math placement exam that was built by our math faculty, designed for our math curriculum. And so just asking the question around, so why are we kind of shortcutting that really good placement exam that, you know, if you don't know anything, it's going to cut you off in 2 minutes and be a pretty low stress exercise. And if you know a lot, it'll carry you through until you're placed in the math course that is appropriate for you. So why are we relying on an exam that's just like a 560, right? That you don't actually know what that 560 is comprised of, right? You can guess that based upon that percentage of answers correct, that like to some degree the student knows what's going on, but it also doesn't actually address like who they are as a math student and what their real competency is. And to me, it's the same thing for writing. So I actually think this is a great opportunity to take a break with our faculty and to actually say like, why are we dependent upon these scores, which are really not like an appropriate essentialization of how students do or do not succeed in our curriculum, right? The math faculty at Redlands are very different from the math faculty at Seattle U. Assumedly, the curriculum are different. Assumedly, there are different competencies needed to be successful in mathematics for engineering majors, for example. So why in the world are we dependent upon this thing, which is really not purpose-built for placement? It's purpose-built for assessment of aptitude based upon your learning thus far. So I've always been really hesitant about math and English SAT as a placement tool. And so I think this is a really good opportunity, again, from my individual perspective, for us to re-examine that tool for that purpose.
Just checking in before we move on if Belinda or Erin have anything they'd like to add to that.
Nothing to add, same thing. We have our own placement tests and we can use those just fine.
Same here.
Okay, excellent. So here's another question. This is sort of a recruitment practice question from Cindy Kiefer. Says, this is my first Acro coffee break, and thanks to all the panelists for sharing their experiences. I wonder if any of you have innovative ideas for keeping your recruitment efforts from feeling like a mix between Max Headroom and Hollywood Squares.
Oh gosh, it's so hard to avoid that, isn't it? One thing that we made a point to do was our presentation was always, a series of photos and slides with information, and we're now using Canva, and what we're doing is taking like snippets of video, and I have 3 people in the office who did a beautiful job putting this together. So while we're talking, there's like this silent video of different things on campus that can sort of visually show what we're talking about, and just make it maybe a little more interesting for students to watch. So when we're talking about the College of Arts and Sciences, we have all these videos that have already been produced. Well, they pulled snippets of those videos to create kind of like a visual representation of what the college is. And that's in addition to our virtual tour And our visit coordinator sits in meetings with other visit coordinators in the Northwest. And someone came up with the idea of a live virtual tour. And so student ambassadors are in there doing the virtual tour, but talking live about it and answering questions and making it more interactive. So those are two things that have popped up that have been successful so far. But we still have the squares and the no faces, just the names that are on the squares, but at least people are saying they enjoyed the presentation.
The only thing I'll just add, thanks, Erin, for that tip. We might be borrowing that. I think what we've just been trying to do is play around with different kinds of events. So, you know, and using different tools. We've started to use Platform Q for some of our events. We use WebEx, which is like Zoom, for others. We have been using, like I said, social media, Instagram Live. So just trying to diversify the tool, and then lots of other stuff, like, you know, we are certainly marketing one-on-one time with counselors. We are exploring the idea of one-on-one time with student ambassadors and that type of thing. So just diversifying the type of event has been helping us.
Yeah, and I'll throw a plug. One thing that Belinda has mentioned is that Instagram's Join Me feature, combined with their Q&A feature, allows you to put on not just a tour, but a tour that can be really like multi-face and multi-location in a really efficient manner. So really exploring that tool, which is free of charge if you've got an Instagram account. I think the other thing is, yeah, varying programs. You know, we're having territory counselors do coffee chats with students, and the registration for those have been amazing, right? Like students actually just liking showing up to chat. The other thing we noticed in our admitted student days is we would do a formal program that was a pre-recorded video with a live hosted chat, and then we would break students into Zoom rooms after the fact. And what we noticed is we would kind of like have to be like, okay, folks, you can stay, but we're leaving, right? Because the students were continuing to like get to know one another and engage and interact. And I would say like that's the last thing that we learned is like, don't forget that they're sitting in their living rooms by themselves or with their families too, right? And so what can you do to create community? What can you do to give them spaces to hang out and get to know one another? Those informal conversations that two students would have an admitted student day that end up being a roommate relationship, right? Like, how are you replicating that experience? And I think that's been the real challenge for us, is to think about how we can do that for our students as we also go on the formal programming train as well.
Thanks for that. Another question. We have recently seen the number of students seeking financial aid declining, which suggests that we may be facing declining access among marginalized and low-income student populations. What is your institution doing to address this important issue? Anyone want to take a stab? It's pretty recent, so you know.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in. One thing that makes me really happy is to know that our administration and budget and financial aid leaders are very aware of where we're headed, and they know that we need to be planning ahead and be proactive. Something we started a couple of years ago, but we've been really quiet about, and we're actually now going to start promoting it better, is a commitment to students in the state of Washington that are Pell eligible. We will meet the full cost of tuition with no loans, so grants and scholarships. So kind of the way we had to look at it was kind of what's our backyard, and really trying to take care of our backyard. And it goes beyond Spokane for us. It really is the whole state of Washington. But then there are some other schools in the state that they can focus on an area code, you know, like the 253 promise or things like that. And kind of think about like what students do you really need because we can't make a commitment like that to everyone who applies. But what group do you really feel like you must serve and serve well? But then also think about ways to improve aid for all students, not just the ones in your backyard. And probably we should all be getting out there and lobbying government for an increase of Pell funding, broadening what that EFC is to qualify for Pell aid. I think it's a bit outdated, and it needs to be improved, and hopefully we can see some changes in the future there.
I'll add that the University of Redlands has a similar program. It's actually called the Cal Grant Guarantee, and it's for students in California that do qualify for the Cal Grant. So there's some work that we're doing kind of at that level, but I also think we really are trying to do better in terms of marketing and messaging and outreach. Trying to demystify, right, a financial aid process, trying to debunk some myths around private colleges just a lot sooner than I think institutions traditionally do. And so we do outreach, with Avid classrooms. Our financial aid office actually is really fantastic, and our financial aid director will go in with some of our local high schools, and we'll actually do presentations in every single government and econ class, just to try to get the word out there about a financial aid process. So I think the marketing and the outreach and the messaging is important too, and that's able to really get to many different communities. So that's what I would add.
Yeah, and the last thing I would add is, especially in these times, filing a FAFSA in the case of the American higher education system is a key performance indicator, right? It's not just an access issue. It's good for your institution when FAFSAs get filed. It's good for the student when FAFSAs get filed. So it's kind of like, what if we ask ourselves, what if we worked as hard to get a student's FAFSA in the door as we work to get their application in the door? And so, questions I would be asking in that questioner's question would be, is your admissions office dynamically aware of who and who has not filed a FAFSA? Is there a communication plan in place for applicants who have indicated they will apply for financial aid on the application and have not filed a FAFSA and have applied, right? Have you done some of those taking care of business things to ensure that FAFSAs are getting filed? Because the way I imagine this is, if we're all as a community focusing on FAFSA completion because it's good for us, but also it's good for students, we lift all boats. And so I hope that especially in this time, we can really think about the FAFSA filing as not just something that tells us whether a student is interested or not, but something we really drive home as one of those things that's just important as learning how to write a good personal statement, or whether or not you should take AP classes. It's just one of those important and fundamental things that we can help to reinforce on our end.
Thanks for that. I think that we are probably out of time for questions. So I'm just going to have to say thank you, a very special thank you to our panelists who gave us some of their time today. This has been a really, really interesting and engaging conversation, and the recording will be available after the fact. So I want to just point out a couple of things. We have upcoming at ACRO, we have a packed virtual schedule. And so there are the next 3 coffee breaks that are currently scheduled, and there will probably be more, are up, and registration is open. We're talking about graduation. We're talking about COVID-19 impact on international enrollment. And we are focusing on test optional and implementing holistic admissions in November. And then if you look to the right of the screen, there is a packed schedule of webinars. We have a new publication on holistic admissions coming out on October 5th. And we have 2 reports that are coming out actually in the next couple of weeks. So lots of content available for you, and I hope that you check it out. We have launched a new communication at ACRO called This Month at ACRO, and that's so that we can share with you all that we have planned for the month so that you can bookmark it and not miss it. You can also check the calendar on our website at any time. So the next slide, I just want to point out that we have our Strategic Enrollment Management Conference coming up at the end of next month. Registration is open now. This will be a full virtual meeting from October 28th to 30th, and we hope that you will join us. It's shaping up to be an incredibly exciting, content-rich program that is very, very relevant to what's happening right now, thinking about re-envisioning higher education and our roles. So we hope that you will join us. Next slide. As a final reminder, when you need help and guidance needs to be tailored specifically to your college and university, we hope that you'll reach out to ACRO Consulting for a convenient and affordable solution. We know right now you need every tool in your toolbox to drive student success and enrollment health, and you can contact us at consulting@acro.org or check into the website to get you started. Thanks again for joining us. I hope you have a fantastic weekend, and I hope to see you online at another event coming up soon. Take care.